Do you know what a man can say to a woman that cuts deeper than betrayal, deeper than infidelity, even deeper than lies? It's when he looks you in the eyes, after years of marriage, and says, "You're a good woman, but I need a real woman." That's what my husband told me before he walked out of our home, our life, our marriage, and straight into the arms of someone he thought was more real than me. I can still hear his voice in my head, like a cruel echo that never fades. A real woman. Those words carved themselves into my memory and built a prison around me. Because how can you forget when the person you trusted most defines you as less than real? We had been married for over 25 years. 25 years of shared mornings and late-night talks. 25 years of paying bills together, arguing about small things, celebrating holidays, raising children, dreaming about retirement. 25 years of being each other's witness in this messy, unpredictable life. I thought that counted for something. It wasn't a perfect marriage, of course not. No marriage is. There were days we barely spoke, days we disagreed about money, about the kids, about the future. But we always came back to each other at night. I thought that meant we were solid. I thought that meant he was mine, and I was his, and nothing could shake that foundation. I was wrong. I remember that Tuesday. Funny how ordinary days turn into earthquakes without warning. He came home early. His face was unreadable, but his eyes looked distant, almost as if he had already left. He sat me down at the kitchen table. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays, blown out candles, and planned our lives. He sat across from me and said those words that ripped my world in two. "You're a good woman, but I need a real woman." At first, I laughed. A nervous laugh, the kind you give when you're sure there's been some mistake, some joke, some misunderstanding. I asked him what he meant. He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. His face was carved in stone. And then he told me about her. Her name was Donna. 10 years younger than me. Slimmer, prettier in that effortless way some women carry themselves. She had a loud, sparkling laugh that made people turn their heads in restaurants. He said she made him feel alive again. She admired him. She looked at him like he was a man worth noticing. And me? Apparently, I had stopped doing that. I sat there, frozen, as he told me how she made him feel like the man he used to be. He told me that with her, he felt seen, valued, respected. He told me he hadn't felt that way in years. And then, just like that, he said he was leaving. No request for counseling. No attempt to fix what was broken. No tears. Just a declaration, like he was announcing a trip he had planned. He was leaving me for her. That night, he packed his bag. By morning, his side of the closet was empty. His toothbrush was gone. His shoes were no longer by the door. It was as if he had been erased from the house in a matter of hours. But not from me. Have you ever had your world collapse so quickly that you can still feel the dust in your lungs? That was me. I begged him not to go. I told him we could make it work, that we could find each other again, that what we had built was too precious to throw away. He listened, but his eyes were far away. He was already living in another home, another bed, another life. And when he walked out the door, it felt like part of me was ripped out and carried with him. The nights were the worst. I'd wake up at 3 a.m, reach for him, and touch nothing but cold sheets. I'd sit in the silence and wonder if he was lying next to her at that very moment, if she was touching him the way I used to, if he was smiling in his sleep because he had found his so-called real woman. And those words haunted me. A real woman. What was I then? A ghost? A shadow? A fraud? I started to look at myself differently. I stared at the wrinkles around my eyes, the silver strands in my hair, the softness of my body. I told myself maybe he was right. Maybe I had expired, like milk left too long in the fridge. Maybe I wasn't enough anymore. I tortured myself with comparisons. I imagined her laughing in ways I no longer did. Wearing dresses I wouldn't dare to wear. Making him feel like the man I had apparently forgotten he was. I hated her. But more than that, I hated myself. The first few months after he left were hell. Every corner of the house whispered his absence. The coffee mug he left behind. The empty space in the closet. The chair at the dinner table that no one sat in anymore. I cried so much my body felt hollow. I screamed into pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I prayed to God to make the pain stop. And when it didn't, I curled into myself and wondered how long a broken heart could keep beating. Friends tried to help. They told me I was better off without him. They told me he would regret it. But when I saw pictures of him and Donna smiling on social media, holding hands, looking younger and freer than ever, I wondered if my friends were lying to comfort me. Because in those photos, he didn't look like a man who regretted anything. He looked like a man reborn. And me? I was the ghost of the woman he left behind. One night, I found myself standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine in my hand, staring at the back door. For the briefest moment, I thought about walking outside, into the cold night, and just never coming back. But then I thought of my children. My grandchildren. My friends who still loved me, even if he didn't. And I put the glass down. That was my lowest point. Slowly, painfully, I began to climb back up. I don't know what snapped in me, but one morning I looked at myself in the mirror and said, enough. Enough tears, enough self-blame, enough waiting for him to come back. He had chosen his path. Now I had to choose mine. So I started small. I cut my hair. Not a dramatic change, just enough to make me feel like I had taken control of something. I bought a new dress that made me feel good in my skin. I signed up for a yoga class, even though I was the oldest one in the room. My body ached, but my spirit started to stretch too. I dug out my old paints and brushes, the ones I hadn't touched since my 20s, and started to paint again. At first, it was clumsy. The colors bled together. But with each brushstroke, I felt something returning to me that I thought was lost forever. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't just his wife. I was me. It wasn't easy. Some days I still cried. Some days the loneliness was heavier than others. But I was learning to live again. To breathe without him. To rediscover myself. And then, just as I was starting to stand on my own, it happened. My phone rang one evening. I looked down and saw his name flash across the screen. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard from him in months. I almost didn't answer. I told myself I shouldn't. But curiosity, and maybe some small, buried piece of love, made me pick up. His voice was not the confident voice of the man who had walked out on me. It was shaky, uncertain, almost desperate. And the first words he said to me were, "I need your help." When I heard those words, I froze. My mind went blank. For a second I thought I had misheard him. This was the man who left me for another woman, the man who told me I wasn't real enough for him, the man who broke our family apart. And now he was calling me, saying he needed my help. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch. I wanted him to feel it, that cold, empty silence I had lived with since the night he walked away. Finally, I asked, "Why are you calling me?" My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded distant, sharp, like it had aged 10 years since the last time I spoke to him. He hesitated. I could hear him breathing on the other end, like he was trying to gather the strength to say something. And then he told me that Donna had left him. Apparently, the real woman, the vibrant, passionate woman who made him feel alive, had found someone else. Younger. Wealthier. Someone who made her feel the way she once made him feel. She packed her things and was gone in a matter of weeks. And just like that, the dream he had thrown our life away for was over. I should have felt joy. I should have felt vindication. I should have laughed in his face and told him he got exactly what he deserved. But instead, I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just emptiness. He started talking fast, telling me how he had made a mistake, how he didn't know what he was thinking, how he had lost himself in a fantasy. He said he realized now what he had given up, that he had taken me for granted, that he had been blind. I closed my eyes and let his words wash over me. These were the words I had prayed for months to hear. I used to lie in bed, clutching his pillow, begging God to send him back to me, to make him realize I was enough. And now, here he was, saying those very things. But it was too late. Something inside me had shifted. The woman who once cried herself to sleep, who blamed herself for his leaving, who begged for him to love her again, she was gone. She had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her worth. I told him I couldn't talk, and I hung up. My hands were shaking, but my heart was steady. The next few days, he kept calling. Sometimes he left voicemails, sometimes he didn't. When I finally listened to one, I could hear the desperation in his voice. He said he was lonely. He said he missed the way I used to take care of him, the way I always knew how to make things right. He said he needed me. But here's the thing, when he left me, he didn't just break my heart. He broke my trust, my faith, my belief in us. And once something like that is broken, no amount of words can glue it back together. Still, his calls stirred something in me. Not love, not forgiveness, but questions. Why was he really calling me? Was it love, or was it just that he had nowhere else to go? Did he want me back, or did he just want someone to patch him up until he could find another Donna? I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I thought back on our life together. The early days, when we were just kids, building a home with more hope than money. The nights we stayed up late, dreaming about the future. The struggles we survived together, layoffs, hospital bills, family crises. I remembered how he used to hold my hand when we walked into a room, how he used to look at me like I was his whole world. Those memories hurt, but they were real. For a long time, we had been happy. And that's what made his betrayal cut so deep. He hadn't just left me. He had erased all of that, dismissed it like it had never mattered. He had looked at me and said I wasn't real, as if the years we spent together were nothing but an illusion. So why now? Why come crawling back, months later, asking for my help? I decided to meet him, if only to see his face and hear the truth in person. We chose a little CAF near the edge of town, a place where no one would know us. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller. His shoulders were slumped, his hair was thinner, his eyes had lost that spark of confidence. He looked like a man who had been chewed up and spit out by life. When he saw me, he stood up quickly, as if he thought I might change my mind and walk away. He smiled, but it was a weak smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. We sat down, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I just looked at him, waiting. Finally, he sighed and said, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let those words heal the wounds he left behind. But instead, I felt a strange calmness. I asked him why he left. I asked him why he thought Donna was a real woman and I wasn't. He looked down at his hands, ashamed. He said it wasn't about me. It was about him. He had been going through a crisis, questioning his worth, his age, his manhood. Donna came along at the right time, said all the right things, made him feel young again. He thought she was the answer to all his problems. But she wasn't. And when the fantasy wore off, when the reality of life crept back in, she didn't want to stick around. She wanted excitement, not responsibility. She wanted adventure, not bills and bad knees. And suddenly, he was alone. And the first person he thought of was me. I listened quietly, my face giving nothing away. He asked if I could forgive him. He asked if I would take him back, if we could start over. And for the first time since he left, I truly understood something. He hadn't come back because he loved me. He had come back because he needed me. Because I was safe. Because I was the woman who had always patched him up, always stood by him, always given more than I got in return. He wasn't here for me. He was here for what I could give him. And that realization burned away any lingering desire to have him back. I told him I didn't know if I could forgive him. I told him I had built a life without him, that I was learning to stand on my own, that I wasn't the same woman he left behind. I told him I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to being her. He looked shocked. He had expected me to fall into his arms, to cry with relief, to beg for him to stay. But I didn't. Because I finally knew the truth, I didn't need him anymore. I still remember the exact moment my life cracked open like fragile glass. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, years ago now, though sometimes it feels as raw as yesterday. My husband of more than 20 years stood in the doorway of our kitchen, his suitcase already packed. The rain beat against the windows, matching the pounding in my chest. And with a voice that was steady but cold, he said the words that would echo in my mind for years: "I can't do this anymore. Eve found someone else. A real woman. A real woman." Those words cut deeper than any blade could. I had given him decades of my life, raising our children, keeping our home together, supporting him through job losses and illnesses, through family deaths and financial struggles. I had believed we were partners, equals, a team. But in that moment, all of it seemed invisible to him. None of it mattered. Because he had found someone new, someone exciting, someone he thought was more real than me. I stood there frozen, my hands still wet from washing dishes, soap bubbles dripping onto the floor. My mouth opened but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, to beg, to demand answers. Instead, I just stared at him, memorizing the lines of his face, the determination in his eyes. He had already made up his mind. I wasn't going to change it. When he left that day, something inside me collapsed. It wasn't just the betrayal of a husband leaving his wife for another woman. It was the cruel implication that I wasn't enough, that after everything, I somehow failed at being a real woman. What did that even mean? Was I not real because my body had softened with age? Because I spent more time caring for others than dressing myself up for him? Because I wasn't 25 and childless, ready to dance until dawn? For months, I asked myself those questions over and over. I replayed every argument we'd had, every quiet night we spent apart, every moment when I could have smiled more, touched him more, made him feel like the center of my universe. The guilt consumed me, even though deep down I knew it wasn't fair. He left me for a woman named Gloria. She was younger than me by almost 15 years, glamorous in a way I never was. High heels, red lipstick, perfectly styled hair. She laughed loudly, touched his arm when she spoke, made him feel like a man again. At least, that's what I told myself in the darkest hours, when I pictured them together. Friends tried to comfort me. They told me he was going through a midlife crisis, that men chase shiny new things when they're afraid of getting old. They told me Gloria wouldn't last, that he would eventually realize what he had lost. But at the time, those words felt empty. Because every night, I lay in bed alone while he was out there living a new life. And I was left to pick up the pieces of the old one. The years that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I had to rebuild everything from scratch: finances, friendships, even my sense of self. At first, I didn't think I could do it. There were mornings when I could barely get out of bed, when the silence of the house pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. But slowly, with time and determination, I began to find myself again. I went back to work full-time, something I hadn't done in years. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during the marriage. I even started traveling, taking trips I had always dreamed about but never thought I deserved. And with each step forward, I discovered something that shocked me: I was stronger alone than I ever was with him. It wasn't easy, of course. There were setbacks and tears, lonely holidays, and birthdays spent without my children because they wanted to spend time with their father's new family. That part cut the deepest. Seeing my kids smile in pictures with Gloria, hearing them talk about her cooking or how she decorated the house. It was like being replaced in every role I had ever played: wife, mother, caretaker. But even in that pain, I refused to let bitterness swallow me. I told myself I would not be defined by his choices. I was still here, still breathing, still capable of joy. And slowly, that became true. Years passed. Gloria and my ex built their life together, and I built mine apart. We had minimal contact, mostly through the children, and even that faded once they grew older and started their own lives. For a long time, I thought I'd never hear from him again. And then, one ordinary morning, the phone rang. It was his number. My heart stuttered when I saw it, as if my body still remembered the pain he caused. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity, or maybe old habits, won out. I picked up. His voice was nothing like I remembered. It was shaky, worn, tired. He didn't sound like the confident man who once declared he had found a real woman. He sounded broken. "Can we talk?" he asked. I wanted to laugh, to slam the phone down, to tell him that he had forfeited the right to talk to me years ago. But something in his tone stopped me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When we met at a small CAF downtown, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner, older, his shoulders slumped as if he carried invisible weights. His once neat hair was gray and unkempt, and his hands shook slightly as he stirred his coffee. "I need your help," he finally said after an awkward silence. His eyes were red, like he hadn't slept in days. I didn't respond at first. I just stared at him, this man who had shattered me, now sitting across from me asking for help. The irony was almost too much to bear. "Why me?" I finally asked. He looked down at his cup, ashamed. "Because you're the only one I can trust. Gloria, she's gone. She left. And I don't know what to do." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Gloria, the woman who was supposedly more real, more alive, more everything than me, she had left him? I wish I could tell you I felt nothing but satisfaction, that I leaned back in my chair and smiled smugly. Part of me did feel that, I won't deny it. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the man I once loved, felt something else: pity. He went on to explain. Gloria had drained him dry, emotionally, financially, even physically. She had convinced him to invest in one doomed business venture after another until his savings were gone. She belittled him when he failed, mocked him for aging, for not keeping up with her lifestyle. And when the money ran out, so did she. It had been months since that first phone call, months since I had seen the man who once called me not real enough sitting across from me in that quiet diner, asking for help. And yet, the memory of his voice, trembling and desperate, still haunted me. I had thought I had moved on, that the gaping wound he left had begun to close. But life has a cruel way of reminding you that some scars never fade completely, they only get covered by layers of cautious strength. After that meeting, he began to call more frequently. At first, I ignored him, let the calls go to voicemail, letting the silence stretch between us. But each message was the same: apologetic, urgent, desperate. He wanted advice, guidance, even something as mundane as help with paperwork and finances. And each time, my resolve wavered just a little. Because no matter what he had done, there was a part of me that remembered the man I once loved, the one who had held me when our first child was born, who had wiped away my tears in the dark, who had promised he would never let anything come between us. One afternoon, I received a particularly long voicemail. He was pleading, almost begging this time. He had made mistakes, financial miscalculations, and apparently, Gloria had left him in chaos. He sounded completely unmoored, a man drifting without a compass. And in that moment, I realized something: He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for help, because he had no one else to turn to. I sat in my living room, listening to the voicemail, gripping the edge of the armchair until my knuckles turned white. I could feel a mixture of anger, sorrow, and pity. Pity. I never thought I would feel pity for the man who had shattered my life, but there it was, undeniable and sharp. It took me a long time to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to teach him a lesson, to let him flounder and realize that the woman he abandoned was no longer at his beck and call. But another part, the part that had once loved him so deeply, knew that helping him didn't mean surrendering to him again. It meant something else. It meant that I had power now, the power to choose how I engaged with the man who had once ruled my world. So I called him back. We met in a small office downtown, a neutral place where we wouldn't bump into old friends or neighbors. He arrived early, pacing nervously outside. When he saw me, his expression softened, a glimmer of the man I once knew flashing for just a moment. He looked like someone who had weathered a storm alone and was utterly exhausted by the effort. "I'm glad you came," he said, voice trembling. "I'm not here to fix your life," I replied carefully. "I'm here to see what kind of man is asking me for help after all this time." He winced but nodded. "I understand. I need guidance. Eve made mistakes, and I don't know how to correct them without losing everything." And so we began. I listened as he detailed his financial disasters, the mistakes he had made, the debts he had accumulated, and the family tensions that had escalated. He spoke rapidly, sometimes jumping from topic to topic, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of his own miscalculations. And through it all, I stayed calm, patient, measured. Because if I was going to help him, I would do it on my terms, not his. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction in that control. For years, I had been the one who held our family together, the one who managed crises while he pursued fantasies. Now, the roles were reversed. He needed me, not as a wife, not as a lover, but as the capable, competent woman he had once taken for granted. Over the weeks that followed, I helped him untangle the mess he had created. We sorted bills, negotiated with creditors, organized paperwork, and mapped out a plan for him to regain stability. Each session was emotionally taxing for me. I had to suppress memories of the life he had abandoned, the nights I cried alone, the milestones he missed. But I also had to remind myself that this was not about rekindling anything. This was about strength, and perhaps, closure. He began to open up more during our meetings. He spoke about his regrets, the things he wished he had done differently. He confessed moments of loneliness and fear he had never admitted to anyone. And despite everything, there were flashes of the man I once knew, the caring, thoughtful man who had made promises I had believed in wholeheartedly. And then came the day he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "I realized something," he said quietly, eyes downcast. "I left you for someone I thought was more alive, more exciting, but I was wrong. You are the real woman. You were always the real woman. I just didn't see it." The words hit me like a cold wave. They were true, yes, but they were also selfish. He had realized it too late, after all the damage had been done. He wasn't acknowledging the years he had wasted, the betrayal he had caused, the trust he had destroyed. He was acknowledging only his own failure, only the loss he now felt. I didn't respond immediately. I simply nodded, letting the silence linger, letting him feel the weight of what he had done without me saying it outright. In the weeks that followed, he continued to lean on me. At times, it frustrated me beyond belief. Here was a man who had once told me I wasn't enough, now relying on me for survival. It was a cruel irony, but I maintained my composure. I helped him because I chose to, not because I owed him anything. And with each meeting, I reminded myself that I was no longer the same woman he had left behind. I had built a life, a world, a self-sufficiency that he could not undo. And then one day, I caught myself wondering something I hadn't expected. Did I feel satisfaction? Perhaps. But there was also an unanticipated complexity to my emotions. I felt a deep, almost academic curiosity about the man he had become, how life had humbled him, how his arrogance had been stripped away by consequences he could not control. And, beneath that, I realized I had begun to feel something else entirely, the quiet power of knowing I had survived, thrived, and even held the potential to guide him back to stability while preserving my own dignity. He didn't ask for love. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for help, and I could provide it. And in that act, I discovered something profound. Helping him wasn't about him at all. It was about reclaiming my agency, proving to myself that I could confront the man who had broken me and emerge unscathed. Every time he looked at me with that familiar mixture of regret and longing, I reminded myself that I was no longer just the woman he had taken for granted. I was someone who had rebuilt herself, someone he could no longer control, someone who had learned the hard lesson that strength comes not from being needed, but from standing firm when others expect you to bend. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the dynamic between us shifted. He became more reliant on my expertise and guidance, less insistent on emotional reconciliation. And I, in turn, found a surprising measure of peace. I realized that the story of betrayal and loss had a new chapter, one in which I retained my dignity, offered assistance without subjugation, and exercised the control that had been denied to me for so long. I would be lying if I said the process was painless. There were moments of anger, moments when his words triggered old grief, moments when I questioned whether I was being fair to myself. But each time, I returned to one truth: he had left me once. I had survived. He had returned, broken and seeking help. And this time, the power rested with me. As I continued to guide him through the mess he had created, I began to notice subtle changes, not in him, necessarily, but in myself. The woman who had once been heartbroken and humiliated now held a quiet authority. I realized that I no longer feared his presence or his judgment. I listened, advised, and helped, all while maintaining the emotional distance I had fought so hard to build. He would glance at me sometimes, a flicker of old recognition in his eyes, as if remembering the woman he once loved. But I had changed. Those glimpses no longer held power over me. I was no longer the desperate, forgiving woman who waited by the phone for a call that might never come. I was someone who had endured, who had rebuilt, who had learned to love herself despite the void he had left. One afternoon, as we sat in my living room going over paperwork, he paused and looked at me with a mix of awe and guilt. "I don't know how you do this," he said softly. "How do you stay so calm after everything you've done?" I smiled faintly, almost without thinking. "I survived," I said simply. "And surviving teaches you things no apology ever can." He nodded, silently absorbing the weight of my words. It was then that I realized, he had come back not for love, not for companionship, but for the woman who had always been competent, capable, and unyielding. And in a strange, unexpected way, I found empowerment in that knowledge. Days turned into weeks, and our meetings became routine. He relied on me less for financial advice as he regained some control over his affairs, but he still sought my counsel, my presence, my guidance. And I, in turn, began to notice something unsettling yet familiar: the old feelings of attachment, of connection, of empathy, were stirring again. I reminded myself repeatedly that this was not love. It was history, familiarity, the echo of shared years that could not simply be erased. And yet, I could not deny the rush of memories, the laughter, the shared hardships, the quiet nights when we spoke about nothing at all and it felt like everything. It was in those moments that I discovered the true strength of my growth. I had the choice, to fall back into the past, to allow myself to be consumed by old emotions, or to stand firm and recognize the power of survival. And each time, I chose the latter. He began to confide in me more deeply, speaking of the loneliness that had plagued him since Gloria left. He told me about sleepless nights, about the fear of aging alone, about the emptiness that accompanied wealth without companionship. And I listened, offering advice without sentimentality, guidance without indulgence. There were moments when he would reach for my hand, a silent plea for connection, but I would pull it back gently, reminding both of us that I was no longer the woman he could claim so easily. He would look at me with regret, a silent acknowledgement of the distance I had built and the strength I had reclaimed. One evening, after a particularly long day of sorting through financial records and correspondence, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I don't know what I would do without you," he admitted. "You wouldn't be the first man to think that," I said calmly. "But you are learning. And that is the difference between then and now." He nodded, humbled, perhaps realizing for the first time that the life he had abandoned was not something he could simply reclaim at will. That lesson, I realized, was the most important one he could learn: the consequences of choices, the power of actions, and the limits of forgiveness. And yet, the complexity of human emotion never fails. Despite the clear boundaries I had established, there were moments when I felt a pang of old affection, a flicker of longing. I had shared decades of my life with this man, after all. We had built a home, raised children, survived crises together. How could those memories be so easily suppressed, even in the face of betrayal? It was a delicate dance, balancing empathy with self-preservation. I found myself reflecting on my own resilience, the ways in which I had grown stronger, wiser, more self-aware. I had transformed from a woman defined by her role as a wife into a woman defined by her own choices, her own boundaries, and her own inner strength. He noticed the change too. Occasionally, he would comment on my composure, my determination, my unwavering patience. And I knew he understood, in a way that words could not convey, that he could not manipulate me as he once did. I was no longer the woman who would forgive blindly or bend to his desires. I was a force he had underestimated, a truth he had ignored, and now, perhaps belatedly, respected. As time went on, the dynamics of our interactions continued to evolve. He became less dependent on me for practical matters, more attentive to his own growth and accountability. And I, in turn, recognized the profound truth of what had happened. I had survived the unimaginable, faced the betrayal that could have destroyed me, and emerged not only intact but stronger than ever. And yet, the story was not without its lessons in human fragility. Despite his pleas and his evident regret, I knew that my forgiveness would never mean erasing the past. Helping him had become an act of self-empowerment, a declaration that I would not be defined by the mistakes of another. It was a conscious choice, a demonstration of boundaries, a reminder that compassion does not require surrender. Through it all, I found a quiet satisfaction, a recognition of the paradoxical power in my position. He had left, believing he would find something more fulfilling, only to return humbled, seeking aid from the very person he had dismissed. And in that reversal, I discovered a sense of mastery, a realization that my worth had never been contingent upon his validation. He did not ask for love, he did not seek reconciliation in the romantic sense. He sought guidance, mentorship, the structure and wisdom I could provide. And in granting him that, I discovered something extraordinary, that power, resilience, and clarity of self could emerge from even the deepest wounds. I realized then that this chapter of my life was not about him at all. It was about me, my survival, my growth, and the affirmation that I could face betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation and still rise, intact and unbroken. As the weeks turned into months, the man who had once abandoned me became a study in humility. He no longer carried the arrogance or the bravado that had once defined him. Instead, he approached every task with caution, every decision with hesitation. And I watched, a silent witness to the consequences of his own choices, quietly aware of the strength I had gained from surviving the life he had left behind. Sometimes, he would pause in the middle of a conversation, look at me, and ask softly, "Do you hate me?" The question was loaded, of course. He wanted reassurance, forgiveness, absolution. But I had learned to separate emotion from action. I did not hate him, not entirely. Hatred is a poison that consumes the one who harbors it. I had learned to transform that anger, that grief, into strength. I looked at him and said, simply, "I don't hate you. But I won't let your mistakes define my life anymore." It was a truth he had to hear, even if he didn't like it. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his lips tightened, the subtle shift in his eyes. He realized that I had moved beyond the woman he had once thought he could control. He began to speak of his regrets more openly. Not just the financial missteps or the failed relationships, but the emotional betrayal, the way he had dismissed me, undervalued me, and left me to shoulder the burdens of our shared life alone. And each confession, each admission of guilt, reinforced a profound truth: the past could not be rewritten. The pain he caused could not be undone. And yet, I was here, offering assistance not as a submissive partner, but as a woman who had reclaimed her power. There were moments when I caught myself reflecting on the years we had spent together, the laughter, the shared triumphs, the quiet nights when everything felt aligned. And yet, for every memory of joy, there was a counterweight: the nights of solitude, the tears, the longing for someone who had chosen someone else. I realized that memory and reality often coexist in tension, shaping our perceptions in ways that are both cruel and enlightening. One day, he asked me a question that took me by surprise. Would you consider being in my life again? Not as a wife, not as before, but just being part of my life. I paused. This was the moment many people might have expected me to crumble, to reach out, to give in to the familiarity of what we once had. But I had changed. I had learned the hard way that attachment without boundaries is dangerous, that love without respect is hollow. I looked at him and said, I will be part of my life. You may be part of it only if it respects the boundaries I have set. Nothing more. Nothing less. He nodded slowly, a mix of relief and understanding in his expression. It was clear that he recognized the new reality: the woman he once dominated was no longer at his mercy. The woman who had suffered in silence had emerged as a figure of strength, resilience, and measured compassion. As time passed, our interactions continued to be guided by these principles. I helped him navigate the complexities he faced, always mindful to maintain the equilibrium between empathy and self-protection. And in doing so, I realized that true power does not come from controlling others, but from mastering oneself. Occasionally, I felt pangs of old emotion, moments when memories stirred and nostalgia whispered through the corridors of my mind. But I also recognized that these emotions were fleeting, that the strength I had cultivated would not be undermined by the echoes of the past. I had learned to hold space for history without allowing it to dictate the present. He came to understand this as well. He began to respect my limits, to appreciate the guidance I provided without expecting submission or emotional surrender. And in that mutual understanding, a new dynamic emerged, one built not on dependency, not on passion, but on respect, acknowledgement, and the unspoken recognition of past wounds. And through it all, I discovered a profound truth about myself. I had been the architect of my own recovery, the author of my own resilience. The man who once defined my world had returned seeking assistance, but the woman he encountered was no longer the same. I had survived betrayal, humiliation, and loss, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully aware of my worth. Helping him did not diminish me. It did not reopen old wounds. Instead, it solidified the knowledge that I could confront the very person who had broken me and retain my power, my dignity, and my self-respect. I had learned to transform pain into wisdom, heartbreak into clarity, and betrayal into a reaffirmation of my own strength. There were days when I would reflect on the strange irony of it all. The man who once claimed that I was not a real woman had returned in need, humbled, and seeking support. And I, the woman who had been abandoned, had the power to aid him while maintaining control over my own life. It was a reversal so profound that it left me both astonished and quietly satisfied. And yet, amidst all the complexity, I knew that this chapter was not about him. It was about me. About the woman who had endured, who had reclaimed her life, who had built strength from the fragments of a shattered past. Helping him was not an act of reconciliation, it was an affirmation of survival, a testament to resilience, and a declaration that no one could define my worth except myself. As the weeks and months continued, I maintained this balance. I guided, I advised, I offered support, but always on my terms, always with the clarity of self that I had fought so hard to achieve. And in doing so, I discovered that true power is not about vengeance, not about dominance, but about choosing how we engage with the world, with others, and with our own history. By the time Gloria's memory faded into rumor and the past became a distant echo, I had fully embraced this new reality. I had survived. I had grown. I had reclaimed my identity. And the man who had once left me for another, now humbled and seeking aid, had no power over me except what I chose to grant. I realized, finally, that life had given me a gift far greater than reconciliation or return. It had given me myself. And that, above all else, was the most real thing I could ever hope to be. The first time he showed up at my door after months of our cautious, structured interactions, I felt something I hadn't expected, a flicker of old anxiety. My heart skipped a beat, not from desire, not from love, but from the unpredictable weight of the past pressing into the present. He looked different this time. Not broken, exactly, but more tentative, more aware of the boundaries I had so carefully built. And yet, he carried with him the same neediness that had first brought him back into my life. He was asking, pleading, relying on me once more. I opened the door slowly, letting him stand there, like a man who had been wandering through the ruins of his own life. I didn't greet him with warmth, nor did I step back in fear. I simply studied him, aware of the irony that he had once left, thinking he could find something better, only to return to the very person he had abandoned. I need your advice again, he said, voice hesitant. Things are complicated, and I don't know who else to turn to. I didn't respond immediately. I watched him fidget, his hands twisting the strap of his bag nervously. There was no pretense now, no arrogance. This was a man stripped of illusion, and I realized that the power dynamics had shifted entirely. Come in, I said finally, stepping aside. We'll see what can be done. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. He had learned to respect the boundaries I had set, but the old familiarity lingered like a ghost. I made coffee, silently observing him as he sat at the edge of the sofa, unsure of how to act in a place that had once been entirely his domain. We spent hours going over the problem at hand, yet another complication in the mess his life had become since Gloria left. As he spoke, I could see the strain etched into his features, the subtle signs of fatigue and anxiety that even years of experience and independence could not erase. And through it all, I felt a mixture of pity, resolve, and satisfaction. Satisfaction not born of revenge, but from knowing that I had endured, and that I could face the man who had once hurt me without fear. It was in that moment I realized the full weight of what had happened. He had walked away from decades of shared life, convinced he would find fulfillment elsewhere, only to discover that life is rarely kind to those who chase illusions. And I, the woman he had dismissed, had not only survived but had grown into someone stronger than he could ever hope to understand. Hours turned into days, as we worked through problem after problem, each step a reminder of the strange, twisted irony of our relationship. And I began to notice something subtle but undeniable, a shift in his demeanor. He was no longer simply asking for help, he was observing me, learning from me, silently acknowledging that I was the anchor in his storm. One evening, after a particularly grueling session of untangling legal documents and financial reports, he looked at me and said something that made my heart tighten with a complex mixture of emotions. You've always been the one I could rely on. Even after everything, you're still incredible. In another time, I might have felt a pang of longing, a flash of hope that the past could be rewritten. But I had changed. I had learned that admiration does not erase betrayal, that words cannot undo years of hurt. I nodded quietly, allowing him to speak, but reserving my judgment, my emotions, and my heart. It was during these sessions that I began to reflect deeply on what it meant to survive, to reclaim agency after betrayal, and to wield power without malice. I realized that helping him was no longer about him at all, it was about me, my strength, and my ability to navigate the complexities of human relationships without losing myself in the process. He began to confide more openly, speaking of loneliness, regrets, and fears that he had never admitted to anyone. And I listened, not as a wife, not as a lover, but as a competent, self-aware woman who understood the limits of compassion. I guided, advised, and corrected, always mindful that my involvement came with boundaries that he must respect. It was a delicate balance, offering help without allowing myself to be drawn back into old patterns of dependency, empathy without forgiveness that could undermine my own power. But I had learned these lessons the hard way, through years of loss, grief, and reflection. And now, I wielded them with precision. There were moments of temptation, of course. The familiarity of shared history, the echoes of intimacy, the ghost of affection, all of it whispered in quiet, tempting tones. But I reminded myself that these were ghosts, not reality. The reality was that he had left, that he had caused immeasurable pain, and that my survival and growth were the true victories of this story. Over time, I noticed a subtle transformation in him as well. He was learning patience, humility, and respect. He no longer approached me with entitlement, no longer assumed that my time, my attention, or my wisdom were his by default. He had learned, painfully, the difference between dependency and genuine guidance. And in observing his transformation, I discovered yet another layer of my own resilience. I realized that I had not only survived his departure, but I had also cultivated the clarity to engage with him on entirely new terms, terms dictated by my own experience, my own authority, and my own understanding of what it meant to be real in this life. As the days passed, our interactions deepened in unexpected ways. He had come to me asking for guidance, yet with each session, it became clear that he was also seeking understanding, an attempt to reconcile the life he had chosen with the life he had abandoned. I listened patiently, aware that this was no longer about mending the past, but about observing how he navigated the consequences of his own choices. There were moments of tension, of course. His old habits, the arrogance and impulsivity that had once defined him, sometimes resurfaced in small, fleeting bursts. But I had learned to respond not with anger, but with measured clarity. I reminded him, gently but firmly, that while I could guide him, would not excuse negligence or ego-driven mistakes. It struck me, repeatedly, how ironic life could be. The man who had once dismissed my strength and competence now leaned on it for survival. He had chased a fantasy, a woman who promised excitement and novelty, only to find emptiness. And I, the woman he had left behind, had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably composed. He would occasionally pause mid-conversation, his eyes meeting mine, and ask softly, "Do you think you'll ever get it right?" I would take a breath, considering my words carefully. "Life doesn't give guarantees," I said, "but it does offer lessons. And the sooner you learn them, the better." It was a hard truth, and I could see him internalize it, the weight of regret pressing on his shoulders. He began to realize, more fully than ever, that success, stability, and even happiness are earned, not inherited or demanded. And in that realization, I saw the first signs of genuine growth. I began to reflect on my own journey as well. Helping him had revealed aspects of myself I hadn't fully appreciated, my patience, my strategic thinking, my ability to maintain control under pressure. I had survived betrayal, abandonment, and heartbreak, yet I was here, guiding a man who had once broken me, without losing myself in the process. There were days when he would express gratitude, small, quiet acknowledgments that he needed but could not always articulate. And I accepted them, not as validation of my worth, which I no longer required from anyone, but as recognition of the skill, patience, and strength I had cultivated through years of hardship. One evening, after an especially challenging day, he looked at me and said, "I never realized how much I took for granted. How much I assumed everything would always be there." I nodded slowly. "Assumptions are dangerous," I said. "They blind us to reality until it's too late. And sometimes, the lessons are painful." He was silent for a long time, and I could see the reflection of his own life mirrored in his expression, regret, acknowledgement, and a dawning awareness of the consequences of neglect. And I realized that my role in his life had shifted completely. I was no longer the wife, the partner, or the object of desire. I was a teacher, a guide, a mirror reflecting the truth he had long avoided. It was in these moments that I understood the depth of my own transformation. The woman who had once cried herself to sleep over his absence was now someone who could observe him, analyze his mistakes, and offer guidance without succumbing to past attachments. I had reclaimed not only my dignity but my autonomy. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of the man I had loved, the one who held me through sorrow, who laughed with me in joy, who promised steadfast devotion. But those glimpses were fleeting, and I treated them as what they were, memories, not possibilities. I had learned that nostalgia could be seductive, but it could also be dangerous if it clouded judgment. He began to change in subtle, but profound ways. His decision-making became more deliberate, his demeanor more respectful, and his acknowledgement of consequences more consistent. And I, in turn, noticed a shift in my own perspective. The power I had gained from surviving his betrayal allowed me to engage with him not as a victim, but as a sovereign individual. And yet, human emotion is rarely linear. Despite my resolve, there were moments when I felt the old pangs, remnants of affection, remnants of shared history, remnants of a connection forged over decades. But I held firm, reminding myself that survival and autonomy were paramount, that love without respect is hollow, and that compassion does not require surrender. I also realized something else, that helping him was a way of reclaiming control over my own narrative. He had abandoned me once, but now, in seeking my guidance, he was operating under rules I set, boundaries I enforced, and respect I demanded. And in that, I found a sense of justice, not vengeful, not bitter, but empowering in its clarity. Through this process, I began to see the full arc of our story, a tale of love, betrayal, regret, and ultimately, resilience. He had left me for someone he imagined would fulfill him in ways I allegedly could not. He had discovered that illusions are fragile, and that reality can be harsh and unforgiving. And I had discovered that survival is not passive, it is an active, conscious choice, requiring patience, discipline, and clarity of self. And then, one day, he asked the question I had anticipated but dreaded, "Do you think there's a chance for us?" I looked at him carefully, weighing my words. There's a chance only if it respects who I am now. But understand this, what we had before no longer exists. If there is anything ahead, it must be built entirely on honesty, equality, and respect, not nostalgia, not need, not regret. He nodded solemnly, and in that moment, I felt the strange mix of relief and gravity that comes from facing the truth head-on. The past could never be undone, but the future, our interactions, our connection, our boundaries, could be consciously chosen. And so, as we continued this delicate dance of guidance, reflection, and accountability, I realized the profound truth: I had been betrayed, abandoned, and underestimated, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully aware of my worth. Helping him was not about him at all, it was about me, my resilience, and my power to navigate life with dignity and clarity. Months had passed since he returned, and the rhythm of our interactions had become familiar yet charged with a quiet intensity. He no longer approached me with entitlement, nor did he expect my compliance. Instead, he sought guidance, structure, and clarity, a reflection of the man he had become through consequence and reflection. And I, the woman he had once left, held the balance of power entirely in my hands. There were moments when the weight of our shared history pressed upon me. The laughter of years past, the intimate understanding, the quiet nights of whispered confidences, all lingered like ghosts. But I treated them as they were, reminders of what had been, not invitations to return. My past with him was a tapestry of lessons, each thread colored by joy, pain, betrayal, and growth. I observed the pattern without becoming entangled once more. One evening, as we reviewed yet another financial dilemma, he looked at me with an intensity that was both sincere and hesitant. "I don't know how I ever got it so wrong," he said quietly. "I don't know how I left everything behind, including you." I felt the familiar stir of old emotions but reminded myself that I was no longer the woman who would be swayed by remorse alone. "You acted on assumptions and desire," I said, calm but firm. "And now you face the consequences. That is how life teaches lessons." His shoulders slumped, the weight of his own misjudgments evident. He was learning, in real time, that admiration and attention cannot replace respect, and that absence can teach truths that presence often conceals. And I watched, quietly satisfied, as he absorbed these truths with humility. There were days when he expressed gratitude, simple acknowledgments of the patience and wisdom I offered. And while I accepted these words, I understood they were not tokens of power, they were reflections of my own mastery, my own resilience, and the clarity I had gained from surviving the very trials he had caused. He began to change subtly, in ways that were both predictable and surprising. He developed more self-discipline, a greater awareness of consequences, and a recognition of the value of genuine guidance over transient pleasure. And I, in turn, realized that my role was no longer one of dominance or control, but of measured influence, a position of strength that came from surviving and thriving rather than from coercion. Occasionally, he would look at me and ask, "Do you think I can ever be the man you deserved?" I paused, choosing my words with care. "Perhaps," I said. "But that depends on whether you can act with integrity, humility, and respect, not just for me, but for yourself and everyone around you. True change is demonstrated in action, not words." He nodded, and I could see the recognition in his eyes, the awareness that he had underestimated both me and life itself, and that redemption, if it were to come, would be earned through consistent effort and sincerity. And yet, amidst the structure, accountability, and lessons, I noticed something remarkable within myself. I was no longer defined by his choices, his absence, or his betrayals. I had built a life that was independent, whole, and resilient. Helping him became less about him and more about celebrating my own survival and asserting my own strength. There were moments when the old connection, the intimacy we once shared, surfaced, not as desire, but as recognition of the shared history that could never be erased. And I acknowledged these moments, not as invitations to return, but as proof that my growth allowed me to observe the past without being controlled by it. Through these months, he became a man transformed by humility, reflection, and consequence. He had come to understand that life's lessons are often painful, that choices carry weight, and that the strength of others should never be taken for granted. And I, the woman he had once abandoned, had become the living testament to resilience, autonomy, and the power of boundaries. There were times when I felt a quiet satisfaction, an understanding that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He had left, thinking he would find fulfillment elsewhere. He had returned humbled, seeking aid, only to encounter a woman who had survived, thrived, and reclaimed her dignity. That realization was not bitter, it was empowering, a confirmation of the lessons life had taught me. As our final months of interaction continued, I came to a profound understanding. Helping him did not diminish me, nor did it signify weakness. It was an assertion of control, an acknowledgement of my own strength, and a demonstration that compassion and resilience can coexist. I had been betrayed, abandoned, and underestimated, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and wholly aware of my worth. And finally, one quiet evening, he said something that crystallized the entire journey. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve your kindness." I looked at him steadily, my voice calm, unwavering. "Kindness is not about deserving," I said. "It is about choosing to act from strength, not weakness. I offer guidance, not forgiveness. I offer support, not surrender. That is the difference you needed to learn." He nodded, and in that moment, I realized that the story had reached its conclusion, not through reconciliation, not through romantic revival, but through the assertion of boundaries, the reclamation of agency, and the transformation of pain into wisdom. As he left my life once more, I felt no sadness, no longing, no regret. I had survived betrayal, endured heartbreak, and emerged whole. I had guided the man who once broke me, not out of love or longing, but out of strength and clarity. And in doing so, I discovered the most profound truth of all: the woman who had once been abandoned, humiliated, and underestimated was now fully herself. Real, resilient, and unshakable. And no one, no regretful man, no fleeting romance, no past mistake, could ever take that away from me. I had become, in every sense, the real woman he had failed to see, and the woman I had always been capable of becoming. And that, finally, was enough.